Great thinkers do not emerge from nowhere. They emerge from libraries, from the accumulated conversations of the past that become, in a fertile mind, the raw material for new ideas. William James was one of the most omnivorous readers in the history of American intellectual life, and tracing the books that shape him is one of the best ways to understand how his mind worked and where his ideas came from. The first great shaping influence was not a book but a person, Ralph Waldo Emerson. James grew up in a household where Emerson was not a historical figure but a family friend. The elder Henry James knew Emerson personally, and the philosopher's ideas suffused the atmosphere of James's childhood like a kind of intellectual weather. Emerson's insistence on self-reliance, on trusting one's own perceptions over inherited authority, on the irreducibly individual character of genuine experience, all of this entered James's thinking at the most fundamental level. When James later argued that each human consciousness was an irreplaceable center of experience and that no abstract system could substitute for the particular, he was building on foundations Emerson had laid. In his scientific education, the decisive figure was Hermann Helmholtz, the German physicist and physiologist whose work on the physiology of perception transformed James's understanding of how the mind and body interact. Helmholtz showed that perception was not passive reception but active construction, that the brain was constantly interpreting, inferring, and filling in gaps. This insight ran through the principles of psychology and anticipated the constructivist view of cognition that became mainstream decades later. The most dramatic intellectual influence in James's personal life was Charles Renouvier, a French philosopher whose work on free will James encountered during his breakdown in the early 1870s. Renouvier argued that free will was not a metaphysical certainty but a practical postulate, something we were justified in assuming because assuming it made genuine moral life possible. This gave James a philosophical framework for his famous diary entry resolution, to believe in free will as his first free act. He credited Renouvier with saving his sanity and possibly his life. Darwin was inescapable for anyone thinking about mind and behavior in the second half of the 19th century. James absorbed The Origin of Species and its implications thoroughly, and his functionalist psychology, his insistence on asking not what are mental states, but what do they do, was deeply Darwinian in spirit. Mental processes, for James, were selected features of organisms. They existed because they helped creatures survive and function. This was a fundamental departure from the introspective psychology of the German school, which asked about the structure of consciousness without asking about its purpose. John Stuart Mill shaped James's empiricism and his moral philosophy, though James ultimately found Mill too systematic and too optimistic about the power of reason to resolve human questions. Mill's utilitarianism struck James as too calculating, too committed to reducing ethics to a single principle. But Mill's empiricist method, the insistence on grounding claims in experience rather than in a priori reasoning, was a permanent influence. Later in his career, James was most deeply affected by reading Henri Bergson and by his encounters with the Vedanta philosophy brought to America by Swami Vivekananda. Bergson's philosophy of duration and creative evolution seemed to James to confirm, from a completely different starting point, the central claims of radical empiricism. Vedanta's account of consciousness as fundamental and all-pervasive intrigued him as an alternative to the materialist orthodoxy of Western science, even if he could not fully accept its metaphysical commitments. What distinguished James's reading was not merely its breadth but what he did with it. He did not read to accumulate information or to master traditions. He read as a practitioner reads, actively, combatively, always asking, what does this mean for how I think about the things I care about most? He transformed everything he encountered, often beyond recognition, into the raw material of his own distinctive vision. The books that made William James were, in the end, only the beginning of a conversation he had to continue and complete himself. Subscribe to The Psychology of William James to explore more of his timeless ideas.